Welcome to The Big Conversation here on Unbelievable with me, Justin Briley. The Big Conversation is a series of shows exploring faith, science, philosophy and what it means to be human in association with the Templeton Religion Trust. Today, our conversation topic is the psychology of belief and do we need God to make sense of life? Well, the Big Conversation partners I'm sitting down with today are Jordan B. Peterson and Susan Blackmore. Jordan Peterson is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and author of the new book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. Jordan rose to prominence in 2016 when his stance on free speech and the threat of legal action for refusing to use transgender pronouns created a media storm. But since then, many new people have discovered his academic work, including a very popular lecture series on the psychology and wisdom of ancient Bible stories. And his new book, 12 Rules for Life, distills much of the wisdom into a guide to leading a meaningful life. Our other guest is Susan Blackmore. She's a psychologist, lecturer, and author of books on consciousness and evolutionary psychology, including The Meme Machine and Seeing Myself, the New Science of Out-of-Body Experiences. And she views many forms of religion as fundamentally negative for human flourishing. She's written, for instance, that religions are an example par excellence of memeplexes that use wicked tricks to ensure their own survival. Well, today we'll be looking at the psychological roots of faith beliefs. Can we make our own rules for life, or are we subject to some higher level of meaning? And are even atheists fundamentally religious deep down? I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. So, Susan and Jordan, welcome along to the programme.
Thanks.
Great to have you.
Thank you, Justin.
We'll start with you, Jordan. You're a hard man to categorise in many ways. Your work actually attracts attention from both believers and non-believers, and many of whom say that you've actually made them reconsider their views about religion, especially many atheists that I've heard on, who have said your work opens up things in a new way. Do you just tend to describe yourself as a religious man at all?
I would definitely describe myself as a religious man, yeah. I think that's fundamentally true. The devil's in the details. So what does that mean exactly?
I've seen you've been asked the question, do you believe in God? And that's not a question you necessarily find it terribly easy to answer.
Well, I don't know what people mean when they say believe. Like it's as if that question explains itself when it's asked. It's like it doesn't. What do you mean by believe? And what do you mean by God? And what makes you think that the question that I'm answering is the same one that you're asking? If this is not something that you can say yes or no to in any straightforward manner. So I find it an off-putting question. And I don't think it's because I'm avoiding the issue. I think that to answer it properly requires books and lectures. So,
do you see yourself at least in the Christian tradition as far as your, I suppose, worldview?
There's no doubt about that because I'm a Westerner. There's no escape from that.
Yeah.
I'm conditioned in every cell as a consequence of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And so I've read a fair bit in other religious traditions and have a reasonable grasp on some of them, I would say, not trying to overestimate my knowledge, but we're saturated in Judeo-Christian ethics, and so...
I've seen you say that you certainly live your life as though God exists.
Yes, I would say, well, to the best of my ability, right, yeah. And I think that that's the fundamental hallmark of belief, is it's how you act, not what you say about what you think you think.
Sure.
What do you know about what you think? Seriously, I mean, we wouldn't need a psychology, an anthropology, a sociology, any of the humanities if our thoughts were transparent to ourselves. They're not in the least.
And you've been
in the least they are, but
you've been willing to be quite critical as well of some of the new atheists. So Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins. What have you made of their particular way of approaching religion?
They just don't take it seriously enough. As far as I'm concerned, they don't contend with the real thinkers.
I know all three of them very well, and I have deep, great arguments with them, and they seem to be taking it seriously. I know what you mean. There's a certain sort of superficiality in the writings of all of them, but as people, I find they really care about these issues.
Care.
Yeah.
They care. There's no doubt about that, and it's not like I'm not sympathetic to the atheist or rationalist claim. I'm perfectly sympathetic to it, but I don't believe that the level of discussion that's characteristic of Dawkins and Dennett and Sam Harris, say, approaches the level of complexity of, say, Friedrich Nietzsche or Dostoevsky.
Well, that would be asking quite a lot, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but if you're going to play in that arena, man, you're going to play with the heavyweights.
But what I've noticed is it's a lot of people who maybe up to a point have been interested in what those people have been saying from the new atheist side, who are also interested in what you're saying. There's an interesting sort of correlation there.
Yeah, definitely.
And why is it that especially some of these potentially, I see a lot of men in this audience are coming to you, Jordan, to sort of sit at your feet and hear what you have to say at this point.
Well, the new atheists have a hell of a time with an active ethic. They say, well, you can build an ethic on rationality. It's like, well, first of all, that's not self-evident. It's possible, but it's by no means self-evident. And their essential existential concept is rather hollow. Like with Harris, for example, when I talked to him twice on 2 different podcasts, and we never really got to his sense of what the ideal society might be. But I've read his writings on the maximization of well-being, for example, and it's just that's just not going anywhere. You can't even measure it properly. And if you're thinking about something like that scientifically, that turns out to be like, that's not a problem. It's a catastrophic problem.
But Sam really goes deeply into the consequences of meditation, and he tells stories about his own experience of how behavior changes. Compassion seems to arise naturally. This is not based on rationality, which is not everything, and I would agree with you there. It's based on practical experience, training in observing one's own thoughts, which is also of interest to you, and in the way behavior changes in ways which he would say, and also query whether it's true, that it's better behavior.
Well,
that being compassionate and kind to people is better. We can't have some great underlying reason why. If you don't have God, it's a very difficult question. You've got to find some basis. But even without one, Sam is trying to say, as I would, that if you spend a lot of time meditating and really becoming to understand yourself and see the consequences of certain thoughts and actions, then better actions follow. That's one of the things I like about his work.
Well, and I'm certainly not questioning his ethical integrity or his commitment to these problems, although I certainly don't think that compassion or kindness constitutes a sufficient grounds for a transcendent ethic. Not in the least. Partly because both, and I can speak about that technically to some degree. Compassion is associated with trait agreeableness fundamentally, and agreeableness is a great short-term strategy for infants. But it's a very bad medium to long-term strategy for adults, and it's by no means the ground upon which an entire complex society can rest. And that's partly what you see playing out right now in the political world, because the politically correct types are very high in compassion. We have research that demonstrates that. But that ethic doesn't work for a sophisticated society.
We were only doing introductions. We're already well into the...
It's my fault. I started. I interrupted.
But let's come to you, Sue. You may be familiar to some unbelievable listeners who have already heard you on the show before. I think you're happy to describe yourself as an atheist. Does that mean for you that you are a naturalist, someone who's committed to a view that our experiences can be fully explained by a purely material world?
No. I mean, I sign up in a way to naturalism groups and beliefs, but because I work on consciousness such a lot, and the problem of how do we relate, the mind-body problem, here's this table, here's my glass of water, we'll agree that if I go like this, it'll go all over the place.
And ruin the microphone.
How does that relate to the taste of the water? These fundamental problems mean I have big queries about naturalism as you described it there.
Okay.
In a much broader sense, yes. As you know, and many listeners will know, I started out being a parapsychologist and rejected ideas of clairvoyance and telepathy and ghosts and poltergeists because of lack of evidence. So that's one way to naturalism, to throw that lot out. I was brought up like you as a Christian, and I threw that out because in the end it didn't make sense to me. So that's another way to say I'm left with naturalism. But I'm not left with a naturalism that explains everything. I'm left with a feeling that that's what I want to try to do, to understand what's going on here in minds, in bodies, in tables and glasses of water. And it's very difficult.
You're well known for picking up the idea of memes that sort of originated at some level with Richard Dawkins, the idea of an idea propagated across generations. And you even went as far as to describe religion as a virus of the mind in terms of its
that was Richard's term, but yes, okay.
Is that a kind of view you would still stand by today?
Yes, but you've got to be careful about what you mean by a virus. I mean, I think if... I often say in lectures, imagine a continuum between what you mean as being a virus of the mind. It's really bad. It's like a flu virus or
usually
AIDS
we
or
think
something.
of a virus in negative terms.
And, yes, and they aren't always. So imagine that you think, religions is utterly bad, or you think religion's utterly wonderful and utterly good, and all in between. I think Richard is way down there, and I'm somewhere here. I think by and large, on balance, the world would be a better place without any religions. But the religions would not thrive if they didn't have within them things which are positive. I mean, we know at a personal level, at a society level, the worst societies are more religious. At a personal level, there's evidence that people are happier and they have better social connections and so on if they're religious. So I don't think we would be stuck with these horrible memes if it weren't for the fact that they also have some good qualities.
What do you make of the whole meme theory and the fact that Sue does feel ultimately...
I think it's a shallow derivation of the idea of archetype, and that Dawkins would do well to read some Jung. In fact, if he thought farther and wasn't as blinded by his a priori stance about religion, he would have found that the deeper explanation of meme is in fact archetype.
I disagree. I mean,
Can you just first of all explain archetype for those who are not perhaps familiar with that particular psychological
Well, an archetype
term?
is partly a pattern of behavior that's grounded in biology. So it's the behavior itself. So you could think about that as both the instinct and the manifestation of that instinct, but it's also the representation of that pattern. So part of what's coded in our mythological stories, for example, are images of typical patterns of behavior. And those are the typical patterns of behavior that make us human. I really want to have this discussion about memes, by the way, because it's really a discussion that needs to be had. Because I think that the meme idea is very interesting, and I do think that there are contagious ideas, but that needs to be chased down much deeper, because there are ideas that are so contagious that we've actually adapted to them biologically. And once that happens, they're no longer merely memes. They're something else. They're built into us. I can give you...
These archetypes, as you described.
Yeah, well, I can give you a kind of example of that. So imagine, I'll have to try to do this relatively rapidly. It's very complicated, so I'm hoping I can do it. So imagine that we live in dominance hierarchies. We don't have to imagine that. That happens to be the case. They're at least 350 million years old. So they're really, really old. So the idea of the archetype of dominance is older than our ability to perceive trees, right? It's really down there. And our nervous system is fully adapted to the existence of dominance hierarchies. It's one of the things the serotonergic system tracks. Okay, so now we also know that your position in a dominance hierarchy, especially if you're male, is proportionate to your reproductive success. The higher you up in the hierarchy, the more likely you are to succeed. Okay, so what that means is that males have been selected for their ability to move up a dominance hierarchy. But that's not quite right. They've been selected for their ability to move up the set of all possible dominance hierarchies. And that's a very abstract set. And there's a set of characteristics that go along with the ability to move up the set of all possible dominance hierarchies that's represented in religious terms as the optimal ethical manner in which to conduct yourself.
I see.
And that's not a meme that's casually passed from person to person. It's way deeper than that.
I think you're being unfair to memes. I would make this response here about the difference between memes and archetypes. So archetypes are there whether we have memes or not. All of that history of evolution is there.
Yes.
So we have, ideas about sex differences or ideas about dominance is a very good example that don't require memes. They can then become memes. And a meme by definition, as Dawkins started it out, is that which is imitated, or that which is copied from person to person. So the idea of dominance hierarchies can be a meme, and all the ideas we build on top of that, as long as we pass it from person to person. Now,
we could certainly think of hierarchies of memes from
yes, indeed,
from ones that are no more than fads that wash across the culture to ones that are permanent. But you were kind of
trivializing memes, and I think the power of the idea of memes is this: we have the first replicator, genes on the planet, and we know the consequences of that, producing all these organisms. But the idea about memes is that they are a second replicator. So genes are copied by chemical processes in bodies. Memes are copied by imitation and other kinds of interactions between human beings, and very little in any other species at all. And that's what gives rise to culture. So the whole theory about memes is one of many ways of trying to understand the evolution of culture. And in that way, I say it's not trivial
quick
at all.
Response, and I want to move on to talking about the 12 rules, Jordan.
Well, the issue is what happens when a meme is so widely distributed that it becomes a determining factor in evolution itself. Because it translates...
meme gene co-interaction.
Yes, exactly. Well, see, that's where I think the religious... For me, that's the grounds of the essential religious instinct. It's a meme gene interaction, and it goes back forever.
Yes.
And I'll finish with this. see, because once you see that there's a meme-gene interaction and that there's selection in favor of a certain meme, let's say, then you open up the entire question of what constitutes the underlying reality. Because, you see, one, this is something I tried to have a talk with about Sam Harris, and we augured in very rapidly. You could say that reality is that which selects. Now, it's not exactly a materialist viewpoint. It's more of an evolutionary viewpoint. And if reality is that which selects, then what's selected by that reality is, in some sense, correct. Now, that's not, well, this is why
yeah, you're adding on that's a big claim you're adding on
I know it's a big claim. I understand it's a big claim, but it's also the central claim of pragmatism.
Let's move it on just a bit, because this is all fascinating stuff.
Yes.
I do want to talk about the book, which I read, found really interesting, Jordan. 12 Rules for Life, very much drawing actually on your biblical series as well. And that was interesting to me. It's almost like, I don't know, psychological theology or something like that. I'm not sure what term to give it, but you constantly draw throughout it. It's a rule book for helping people to lead meaningful lives, very practical in that sense, but stacked with illustrations and stories from biblical stories, Adam and Eve, the flood, Cain and Abel, and so on, and Jesus as well. Why has that particularly been your focus recently, to explain life and psychology from this very religious standpoint?
Well, I wouldn't say recently. I think I've been doing this since about 1985. But the reason, there's multiple reasons. The fundamental reason is because I was trying to solve three problems, I would say. One would be the problem of how to live in the face of the undeniable tragedy of life. The other is what to do with the fact that malevolence exists. And those are the two most fundamental questions, and they're interrelated, because what happens is that the apprehension of tragedy is one of the things that drives people towards malevolence. I have a chapter in there called "Don't Criticize the World Until You Put Your House in Order," and I draw writings there from some of the worst people of whose actions I'm familiar with, like the Columbine high school shooters and mass murderer named Carl Panzram, who's a very insightful person. And I've tried to track how it is that people develop a malevolent attitude towards being, I would say, towards life. And that's intrinsically associated with tragedy. Well, these great stories that we have, part of the substructure of our culture, are antidotes to both malevolence and tragedy. That's what, and I mean that, I'm not necessarily even saying that they're successful antidotes, but the reason that they were formulated, the deep reason, is as a response to the tragic conditions of life and to malevolence. And then my experience in delving into these stories is that the farther I delve into them, the deeper they get, and that never ends. Just when I think I've got to the bottom of a story, like the story of Cain and Abel, which is like 12 sentences long. I mean, it's so short, it's unbelievable. It has no bottom. And that's a really fascinating phenomena. I guess it's partly, like the Bible is a hyperlinked text, so that every verse refers to many other verses. And so you never get to the end of it in some sense. But then it's also hyperlinked with the entire culture around it. And then I also think that because the stories in Genesis, especially the first part of Genesis, are deeply mimetic in the sense that you've been describing, that they have a kind of biological depth that's unparalleled as well. Yes, they have a life of their own, that's for sure. A life that lasts a lot longer than the mere lives of mortals, let's say. So,
and the rules all have, quite fun titles in a way. In fact, I think they originally came from a blog post you put up on an internet website, but you've obviously developed them in all kinds of different ways. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. Rule number 2, treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping. Number 3, make friends with people who want the best for you, and so on. I guess I'd be interested to know what your response, having had a chance to look at the book, is to this way of looking at life and how we create meaning for ourselves in the process.
Is my reaction, if you like. It's so full of lovely stories, really interesting, thought-provoking stories. Wisdom, lots of wisdom all over the place. Then the Bible stories. Then this...
You just don't understand that? You don't get why the Bible is being invoked?
I get it in this sense, that those stories, many of them, are very deep and have something to tell us. But it's the way I think that Jordan kind of slithers from a good idea about this might be a good way to live your life to this story. I mean, let me give you an example. You talk about, with great knowledge, about the evolutionary arms race between the size of babies' heads and the size of women's pelvises. And this is something that's always fascinated me. I think it's meme-driven that, we've ended up with childbirth being painful, as I well know, and you probably don't, how painful it is. For those reasons. But then later in the book, you bring in the story of Adam and Eve and how God says, women will suffer and so on. And the implication, not clearly stated, but the implication to the reader is God did it. Now, on the one hand, you're saying, look, we evolved this way. This pain and suffering is an inevitable consequence of the way that evolution has played out. And in the other, you're kind of luring people into believing that God actually made that. And even worse than that, the idea that it at least speaks to me, that somehow we're so bad and deserve all that suffering, which in other places in the book you try and get rid of, that we shouldn't feel so wicked and bad.
How do you respond to that, Jordan?
Well, you asked a little bit earlier you were talking about psychological theology, and I did this lecture series on Genesis, 15 lectures on Genesis, and it was called a psychological interpretation of the biblical stories, psychological approach to the biblical stories, I think. And I've been trying to do that. Like, I'm not a theologian, even though I'm very interested in these stories. And what I was trying to do I do believe that the biblical texts are foundational. I believe it in the Nietzschean sense. And, Nietzsche, of course, announced famously in the late 1800s that God was dead. And the typical rationalist atheist regards that as a triumphalist proclamation. But that wasn't that for Nietzsche. And Nietzsche knew perfectly well and said immediately afterward that the consequences of that was going to be bloody catastrophe because everything was going to fall. And he predicted the rise of communism, for example, and the deaths of tens of millions of people in the aftermath of the death of God. Because Nietzsche knew perfectly well that when you pull the cornerstone out from underneath a building, that even though it may stay aloft in midair like a cartoon character that's wandered off a cliff for some period of time, that it will inevitably crumble and that it will be replaced by something that's perhaps far worse. Now, Nietzsche hoped it would be replaced by man's ability to recreate meaning spontaneously out of his psyche, for example, which I think is a doomed enterprise. But he knew that in the interval, it would be replaced by both nihilism and by communist totalitarianism, which is a hell of a prediction because it was done like 40 years before the events actually unfolded.
Well, you can see it that way, but if that is the case, why do we have evidence that the most dysfunctional societies today are the most religious? And, for example, in the United States of America, if you go across different states, the higher belief in God is proclaimed belief in God, whatever you think that means, the more murders, suicide, marital breakdown, various measures of dysfunctional society are.
Well, it depends on how you define religion, in part. I mean, first of all, America is a very religious country. And to think of it as a country that's doing worse than other countries in the world is just not the case.
Well, its incarceration rate is higher than any other.
Well, true, but so is its standard
society
of living and its what would you say, ability to provide the basic essentials of life for people and the essential freedoms that go along with that. You wouldn't compare that to an African dictatorship.
No. But most of these studies have been done only in developed societies. But there, if you look at income inequality, that's much worse in the States. So yes, a lot of people in the States have a very high standard of living, but the poorest are really poor.
Yes, well, income inequality.
With Obamacare being dismantled and so on.
Well,
but nevertheless, let me go back to that point. We know that more dysfunctional societies have higher proclaimed belief, higher attendance in church, and so on. Now, this doesn't fit with what you were saying. Now, Nietzsche's ideas are very profound and interesting, but I just want to stop you from saying that he was absolutely right about somehow if we get rid of God, we're going to be worse, because we have very well-functioning societies in Scandinavia,
we were pretty
example.
Bad in the 20th century.
Oh, we were, yes. People were.
And we could easily drift that way again.
And there have been terrible bad things done in the name of God, and there have been terrible bad things done in the name of communism and atheism. I don't think we can. I don't want to weigh them up.
I'll weigh them up.
You'll weigh them up and you'll say...
No problem.
But then you have to go against this evidence that I've just stated.
Jordan, come back on this evidence. I mean, obviously, from her perspective, Sue feels like actually we've got pretty stable societies that are increasingly secular these days. So perhaps Nietzsche was wrong, and in fact, we're not going to see this moral
I would say
decay.
they're stable to the degree that they're actually not secular. And this is also a Nietzschean observation, and a Dostoevskian observation for that matter, is that we're living on the corpse of our ancestors, like we always have. That's a very old idea. But that stops being nourishing and starts to become rotten unless you replenish it. And I don't think we are replenishing it. We're in danger of we're living on borrowed time and in danger of running out of it. I think that the reason that the Western societies essentially work quite well is because they act out a Judeo-Christian ethic, and one that's essentially predicated on utmost regard for the sovereignty of the individual. So the individual is sovereign in relationship to the state, which is a remarkable idea and one that's fundamentally religious in its essence, in my mode of thinking, and that's also predicated on honest speech. And there's other predicates as well, but those are religious predicates in my estimation.
There's a section actually, Sue, in Jordan's book where he says this: Christianity elevated the individual soul, placing slave and master, commoner and nobleman alike on the same metaphysical footing, rendering them equal before God and the law. It's nothing short of a miracle. He has a very high view of what Christianity has done for the world, whether or not it's objectively true. What do you take from it?
Well, that evidence that I was discussing earlier, that there's plenty of now, that the most dysfunctional societies are also the most believing societies. There are lots of hypotheses about why that is the case. But I would like to challenge Jordan on the implication that he put before, that because a lot of these of our moral stance today comes from religion, and not all of it does, that it has to have that as a basis. I don't think it does. I feel very grateful to live in a country where now, at last, the majority are not religious. It's just tipped over in the latest polls. And in fact, coming up on the train from Devon today, I got chatting with various people. The assumption that I find here, I don't know what it's like in Canada, is I always start with assuming someone's an atheist, and it nearly always turns out to be there. Oh yeah, all that religion stuff, you know. It's very, very common in this country. Now, we have not descended into being a terrible country. We have, yes, we have our problems.
We're still fairly early on in the experiment, I suppose, of ditching God.
Like about 10 years.
Yes, I will await with interest and hope I live long enough to see. But then if we look at many of the Scandinavian countries, which are way ahead of us in that move, they have wonderful health systems, welfare state, support for people out of work, and so on.
I'd be really interested in hearing your response to all this then, Jordan. Ultimately, we can divorce the good principles that we may have had in some respects from religion ultimately, and still leave perfectly happy secular
Well, it depends.
lives.
See, a lot of this depends on your definition of religion. Like, I know perfectly well from my own empirical studies that there's at least two disparate sets of phenomena that might be regarded as religious, right? There's the dogmatic element, which is really what Sue's referring to when she talks about the pathology of religious belief. And there's the spiritual element. And the dogmatic element tends to appeal to people who are essentially conservative in their temperamental nature. And I mean that scientifically speaking. And the meaningful element, the spiritual element, let's say, tends to appeal to people who are more liberal in their temperamental fundamentals. And religion overall is a continual dialogue between the dogmatic element and the spiritual element. And if either of those exceeds its proper boundaries, then there's a degenerative consequence. Like if the spiritual types get the upper hand, then the structure disappears. And if the dogmatic types get the upper hand, then everything clamps down into too much stasis. So to make a direct claim, say, between the existence of dogmatic belief and the pathology of society, and then to assume that that encompasses the entire relationship between religion and the functioning of society, I think is based upon an unfortunate narrowing of the definition of what constitutes religious. But then back to the idea that our moral claims can be divorced from the religious substrate. It depends on what you mean, and here we go with the definition, by moral substrate, or religious substrate. Let's say that I regard you as a sovereign individual. Well, the question is, what does that mean? It might just be an opinion. It might just be a meme. It might be reflective of something far deeper. So deep that if we transgress against it, it will be fatal. And my investigations have convinced me that that's exactly the case, that although it may be a rational claim, it may be an enlightenment claim as well, that there's something underneath it that's so much deeper than that to reduce it to mere rationality or to mere enlightenment claim is to do it an immense disservice. And also to fall prey, I would say, to the postmodern quandary, because the postmodern quandary is all belief systems are equally invalid. It's something like that. And that's a real problem when you try to erect a belief system on purely rational axioms. So, and you can't, besides that, you can't even do it. It's like, I don't respect you as an individual for rational means. The rationality didn't precede my respect for you. It's way deeper than that. It's embodied, for example. It's,
And
it's built into our emotions
you
and
have
our motivations.
this issue with rationalism and the Enlightenment and so on, where you feel that those who appeal to that as somehow we're in this golden age now are forgetting that it's all built on a much deeper, longer evolutionary psychological history, which is completely different to rationalism per se.
Yeah, well, I see a university professor. Let's take Dawkins, for example. He's the sovereign, rational individual, but there's a wall around him. That's the wall, let's say, of his university, and then outside the university there's the wall of the town, and outside the town there's the wall of the state and the wall of the country, and there's just these concentric rings that are protecting him, and he can stand in the middle and say, well, I'm divorced from all that. It doesn't undergird me. It's like it undergirds you to a degree that you can't possibly imagine, and you're living on the, well, really it is the resources that have been gathered painfully and bloodily in the past, and saying, well, we can just detach ourselves from that and float off. It's like, no, you can't. You don't understand what you're talking about.
All that leads me to gratitude for all that we have. I mean, I recognize that. I recognize that nothing to do with any religious basis at all. I recognize that I could not come on the train here, have a really interesting discussion, meet Justin again, have a nice glass of cool water, without a load of other people doing it for me. That gratitude, which is one of the things that you quite rightly put into your book, it gives good place to it, and it's very important. That doesn't come from anything religious, unless you say because I was brought up a Christian, it came from there. But I don't base it on that anymore.
What do you think it comes from?
I think it comes from a recognition that I've done a lot of meditation. I've meditated every day for 30 years, and I think this has something to do with it. But it's observing the inner consequences of different ways of confronting the world. And I'm much more in recent years in the habit of waking up in the morning, even if it's raining in January in England, and looking out and going, oh, and it's a feeling of gratitude, not gratitude towards God or towards anybody or anything, just free-floating gratitude. That seems to have a positive consequence. I set the day up better, and it's kind of self-perpetuating. It pops up again and again.
Do you think you can just have gratitude in general, or must gratitude always be given towards something and ultimately God?
That's a good question. That goes back to our discussion about acting things out. Like, gratitude is something you feel towards something. And you can say, well, I don't feel it towards anything in particular. And I would say, all right, well, the diffuse nothing that you feel it towards serves in your psychological hierarchy as your equivalent of God.
No, but it's gratitude. This morning, for example, I looked out and it was so green. We've had frosts and it's been white the last few days, and it was green this morning, and it was just gratitude to the universe, if you like. It's not really God because it's not a creator. It's not anything I can pray to. I know.
Why feel gratitude towards it then?
I don't know, but I find
That's fine.
I know that you tackle in this book that happiness is not an ultimate good, and I struggle
it's just not an ultimate goal.
Oh, okay.
I didn't say it wasn't an ultimate
all right,
good.
All right, okay.
There's a big difference between those things.
You're right. You picked me up correctly on that. Nevertheless, we are happiness-seeking creatures, and I have found through practice and growing older that acting gratitude, thinking gratitude, feeling gratitude makes me happier and seems to rub off on other people.
So I don't think we are happiness-seeking creatures, and I think it's a low goal. Not because there's something wrong with being happy, because, thank God if you get to be happy now and then. But I don't think that that's what we seek. I think we seek a meaning that's deep enough to sustain us through tragedy. And that is way different.
Do you know, when I hit tragedy is too strong a word, I think, but when horrible things happen to me, or I feel, or I read some terrible thing going on in the world, yes, those are tragedies going on in the world, my response is, nothing matters. It's all empty and meaningless. This is how the world is. Get used to it. Get on with it, girl.
That sounds like a very Zen Buddhist way of dealing. I guess it is. Meaning.
Well, it's a paradoxical way, though. Because
it is kind of paradoxical.
The first part of that is nihilistic, and the second part isn't. So how do you reconcile those two things? Why get on with it, girl?
Because well, here's another thing. I've often done this with my students. Let's suppose you become nihilistic. Nothing matters. There's no point in doing it. I think we live in a pointless universe. What are you going to do? And I say to them, like William James in his wonderful thing about getting up in the morning, but that's a slightly different point that he makes there. But I say to them, okay, tomorrow morning, when you wake up, think it's all pointless. There's no point in doing anything. Now, what are you going to do? Well, actually, you're going to need to go to the loo. You're going to get out of bed and you're going to go to the bathroom. And when you're there, you'll think, actually, I'm hungry. I think I want to go down to the kitchen. I probably should put my slippers on. Why don't I get dressed? You go and have something to eat. And then you think, I'm bored. And you go to university and get into your lectures. And, we are not creatures who will just not do anything. To me, to go through that process, which I've done in the past a lot, and it's just natural now, is a very positive way of living. To accept the meaningless and ultimate emptiness of everything, and accept that this creature here, this thing, this evolved creature just will get on with life.
But you're not accepting the meaninglessness of it, even by going through those actions that you described.
You don't think so?
Not at all, because you're acting as if those things are meaningful.
Yes, I am. I'm acting as though those things are
You're pretending that they're meaningful?
Pardon?
Are you pretending that they're meaningful?
No, I'm not pretending. My way of putting it would be that those meanings are constructed by myself and others.
They're personal
and they're because the kind of creatures we are, because of the
But they're not constructed.
I'd like to hear
Hunger
Jordan's
isn't
response to
constructed. Neither is your desire to use the loo. None of that's constructed.
No. But the fact that there is a loo is part of culture.
Yeah, well, thank God for that.
Yeah.
But see...
thank God, would you, for that? Sorry, that's a poor joke.
Well, you see, so imagine this. You have the proximal meanings that you described that are sort of a priori, right?
Yep.
They're handed to you. You might consider them as needs or drives, although they're not. They're personalities. That's not the right way of conceptualizing them. But then there's the intermingling of all those needs and drives, let's say, and that constitutes a new layer of structure, because it isn't just that you have to eat and that you have to use the washroom and that you have to have something to drink and that you have to be warm enough or cool enough to survive. It's that you have to do all those things at the same time in a situation where you're going to have to propagate that across time, and you're going to have to do it with a bunch of other people. Yep. And it's always been like that. And so what that means is that out of those proximal meanings, higher meanings arise. And you might say, well, those meanings are arbitrary. And I would think those are religious meanings.
I wouldn't say they are arbitrary, but I would say they were constructed. It's very interesting. Reading your book...
What do you mean by constructed?
Well, they are a consequence of mimetic evolution, of the language that people are brought up in, the culture they live in, the arguments they have. I mean,
what about the biology that they're given?
Well, we start with the biology, and the memes build on top of that.
The memes are biology too.
Well, by definition, they are. Well,
see, this is the thing.
I would follow Dawkins in saying, well, talk about genes as biology, talk about memes as culture. That's all I meant by dividing that. But let me say this.
Yeah, but I don't accept that division.
But I want to get back to what we're saying about meaning. Reading your book made me think a lot about what you mean by meaning, and your claim that we should have a meaningful life or strive for a meaningful life, that meaningfulness is important. And I kept asking myself, do I live that way? What meanings does my life have? And, if I think of something like, well, most of my striving goes into writing my books. Mm-hmm. And is that meaningful? And again, I have the same response when I ask myself that question. It's just what this body does.
Then you should listen to the body and stop listening to the thing that's criticizing it.
And what would the body say?
It would say, write your book and try to be as clear as you possibly can
that's
about
what I do. And that's
right,
exactly what I do.
What I said at the beginning is that the atheist types act out a religious structure and criticize it.
No, there's no religious structure. We come to this big question now.
Let me get to this question, because I did want to get to this, because you have a fascinating part in your book, Jordan, where you do say this. You're simply not addressing atheists. You say you're simply not an atheist in your actions, and it is your actions.
Or if you are, look out.
And it is your actions that most accurately reflect your religious beliefs. What do you mean by that? Why are you saying that no one is really an atheist deep down?
I didn't say no one was.
Okay.
I said that most of the people who claim to be atheists aren't. So this is why I like Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, because Raskolnikov tried to act like an atheist, right? He took the ideas that were floating around, Dostoevsky took the ideas that were floating around in the late 1800s, which are still the ideas that we're discussing today. One most fundamental idea, I suppose, being after Nietzsche's announcement of the death of God, that if there is no God, then anything is permitted. That was Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov's the criminal in Crime and Punishment, the murderer. He gets away with his murder, technically, but not psychologically. And he decides that if there's no God, anything is permitted.
But
and
this
he can't
doesn't
see
have
a reason.
to be true. That's a person in a character in a novel. I don't think that's so.
Well, let's hear the end of that story. And what do you take away from what Dostoevsky has to say about?
Well, Dostoevsky's takeaway was that there was a moral law that Raskolnikov was breaking, even though he rationalized his way through it. Like, he committed the perfect murder, right? He murdered a woman who people would have voted to murder, and then he got away with it. And he did it for good reasons, at least reasons that he could rationalize as good. And then he got away with it, but it destroyed his soul. And Dostoevsky's right about that. And one of the things I like about Dostoevsky as compared to Nietzsche, say, because I think Dostoevsky is the profounder of the two, is that in the Brothers Karamazov, for example, Ivan is the atheist, and Ivan is everything you'd want a man to be, like, seriously. And Dostoevsky, man, he doesn't straw man his opponents. The most powerful characters in his books are always the opponents of what he himself believes. And Ivan is always arguing with Alyosha, who's his younger brother, who's a monastic novitiate and really can't articulate himself very well, has nowhere near the force or charisma of Ivan. But Alyosha wins the drama, even though he loses all the arguments. And that's where Dostoevsky is so great. It's like, and this is what you're doing in your life. You're acting out the logos, Susan. That's what you're doing. You're writing books to illuminate the world.
Yes.
You say,
and
well, I
that's
don't
not
believe
coming
in
from
that.
a place of
do.
meaninglessness.
Don't you think it's kind of offensive to say to me that I'm not an atheist when I am? Why don't answer me this question? Why do you think I don't go around murdering people? Why do you think I go around trying to be?
I don't know you well enough to know.
Yes, I could have done something.
I think often the reason that people don't do it is because they're too cowardly.
Oh, that could be a reason. It could be that I don't murder people. I'd really
No,
love
I'm not
to.
necessarily saying you.
No, it's a possible one.
It's
All
in
right,
fact
all right.
highly likely at
Yes.
sometimes in your life
But
if you're a
it's
normal
very-
person.
We're needing to close things out, and
Dear, the end
I
already.
know it's we've had not long enough, but Jordan, just come back to this, because I want to hear why ultimately, despite everything that Sue said there, you still think she's behaving as though there is, in some sense, a God or some ultimate meaning, even though she protests that no, that's simply
Well, I would
not
say
part of
she's
her worldview.
acting it out. Well, for example, the act of writing a book. I mean, the Judeo-Christian culture is the culture of the book. It's the revelation of the proper mode of being in written form. It's not only that, but it's a large part of that. It's the culture of the book. You're acting out the culture of the book. It's thousands of years old, and the true voice in the culture of the book is the logos. That's what it is, technically speaking. And so she's acting out the logos and writing a book. It's like, and then she says, well, I don't believe in God. It's like, okay, that's fine.
The logos, of
Acting
course,
like you do is fine.
in Scripture, in the New Testament, is
The word.
is brought into the Word, and it, of course,
It's
relates
the word
to
that brings order out
and
of chaos.
to Jesus Christ as
Yes.
the sort of personification almost of that.
Right. He's the archetypal manifestation of the logos.
I mean,
That's-
these are all big words and things. I mean, a lot of people will be asking, what do you actually make of, in Christian terms, the figure of Jesus? Do you believe that he was in some sense divine? Was there, when you look at what the Bible tells us about Jesus?
Well, one thing you might ask yourself is, do you believe that each individual is divine in some sense? And I would say, well, perhaps not, but you act as though you do. And our law acts as if it does. It's predicated on that idea, because the sovereignty of the individual is the divinity of the individual. There's no difference between those two things. And I can make an absolutely brutally clear case for the development of that idea historically. I've traced it back to Mesopotamia, at least in its earliest written forms. I mean, originally the only real sovereign individuals were the sovereigns, right? The emperors and pharaohs. But the idea of the sovereign individual descended down the hierarchy of power, so to speak, until with Christianity it was universalized. We're each sovereign individuals, and that means that the law itself is written as if we each contain a spark of divinity. And so then I think, well, what is that divinity? And in the Christian worldview, well, that's the logos. That's the true speech that brings forth habitable and good order from the chaos of potential.
And in your view, whether she likes it or not, Sue is at some level a benefactor of that reality of what
Not
undergirds
a contributor, not only much better than merely being a benefactor, an active contributor. It's no easy thing to write a book and to get your thoughts straight and to put them forward into the world.
But she
One
couldn't do it
consequence-
without this idea, in a sense, of God. That
She doesn't need the
undergoes it.
idea, even it's embodied. She's
Okay.
acting it out.
The one of the consequences of the way I've been thinking about it, and Sam Harris talks about this too, is the way I think about it prevents me going, ooh, I'm so clever, I've written a brilliant book. I mean, it doesn't always. I have those thoughts come up, but I've got quite good at seeing them coming up and going, oh, there comes that thought again, because I'm taking the view that these books are, the memes are doing it through this organism here. And I have
that
fun.
That would be the eternal logos manifesting itself.
All right,
within
if you want to
no,
put it in those
but
terms.
I'm not playing games. Like, that's the oldest language we have for that sort of thing. And the logos that I'm talking about is the integration of those motivational forces that you were describing. It's not merely a meme. Like, that's where Dawkins is wrong about that. There isn't biology and memes. The interactions matter. They're crucial. They're crucial. Some of these memes are millions of years old.
But you've slipped away, if I can bring you back to Justin's question, really, because you slithered out of it. I think in your question was Jesus different from the rest of us by saying, oh, we've all got a spark of divinity. But do you then believe that Jesus was somehow divine in a sense that's other than what I am? What was it, did he do miracles? Was he, all of that stuff that
Quick
makes him...
answer, and then we'll finish with a final question.
Quick answer. How about this? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. That's a miracle. That's the separation of church and state in one sentence. So there's a miracle for you.
We're going to go for a final question. I'm going to ask it for both of you, which is the question we began with. We're talking about the psychology of belief. Do we need God to make sense of life? Your 1 minute answer begins now, Sue.
Absolutely not. That will do for an answer.
Okay. Do we need God to make sense of life, Jordan?
Well, God is what you use to make sense of your life, by definition. This is one of the things I learned from Jung. The highest value, you have a hierarchy of values. You have to. Otherwise, you can't act, or you're painfully confused. You have a hierarchy of values. Whatever is at the top of that hierarchy of values serves the function of God for you. Now, it may be a God that you don't believe in, or a God that you can't name, but it doesn't matter, because it's God for you. And what you think about God has very little impact on how God is acting within you, whatever God it is that you happen to be, let's say, following.
It's been fascinating to share this time with you both. Thank you so much for being with me on the programme. Sue and Jordan, all the very best.
Thanks very much for the
I've
invitation.
enjoyed it.
Nice talking with you.